Well, hello. Nancy Cogar here, and welcome to another episode of Boomer Time. As you know, I'm your host, and I'm here. My objective is to help you better prepare for all the issues that come up, legal or otherwise, as we age, right? Well, I'm going to kind of take a turn today when today's episode might be a little downright juicy. That's right. Well, it's important too. Today we're talking about funeral home drama. You don't want it? I've heard about it plenty of times. You may worry about it. You got that one loose cannon in the family that may show up at the funeral, right? And you just don't know what they're going to do. I've got a few of those in my own family, so I know your pain. When family feuds, old grudges, poor planning, all of that collide into one of the most emotional times in your life, it can lead to just chaos, right? Stories of everything, the brawls, the breakdowns, yeah, and even the fist fight next to the casket. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's talk about how you can spare your loved ones a soap opera when the time comes. And I'm going to kick it off with a few real life stories. Of course, the names have been changed, right, to protect the guilty and the innocent, right? But I'm sure some of these scenarios will sound mighty familiar to you. And let me know, too, if you've experienced any kind of funeral home drama with family. I'd love to hear those stories. You can send those to me at nancycogar.com. So, first one has to do with outfits. He's not wearing that incident. The final attire for a late family member, as you know, is an important decision. Some people take it really seriously. This is what the loved one will be wearing for eternity, at least eternity here on earth, right? You want them to look good. The family, involved here had a knocked down drag out over the outfit that their late father would be wearing. The brother insisted that their father be buried in a Hawaiian shirt and cargo shorts and some flip flops. Well, the much more traditional sister on the other side wanted dad in a classic suit, navy with a pocket square, right? Well, all that the funeral director had to pause while the service, before it could proceed, while the siblings verbally duked it out in the lobby. Can you imagine? Well, you probably can, or you've probably seen it. They ended up compromising. Dad was buried in the suit, but he had the flip flops on. I kid you not. So the moral of the story is write down your funeral wishes, folks. Yes, even down to the shoes you want to wear or the flip flops. So this one might be even worse. And I found this story online out of New Jersey. Okay. This is where the family had provided clothing to their family member ahead of time for the service. It was the plan for the family member to be cremated. So they would be dressed and cremated in that outfit. The family came the day before to the funeral home to check on things and say their last goodbyes before the cremation service. Apparently, they came face to face with not their loved one, but a stranger dressed in the nines in their family member's clothes. Oops. Here's one is actually close to home for me. I will tell you right off the bat. Call it the missing ring. So, at another service for the family matriarch who lived a healthy 104 years, which I know this to be true, as I said, as it involves a family member, distant though. The daughter glanced down at her mother in the coffin and noticed that her mother's heirloom diamond ring, the one she had promised her since childhood, wasn't on Mama's finger. Where was it? Well, there's that one family member, right? You know him or her. He had just been seen a few moments ago by his late mother's side, weeping, and before backing away, gave his mother's hand a sweet farewell kiss on the hand. Hmm. Well, he was asked to spit it out, and it went back on Mama's hand. So the takeaway with this one, keep an eye on that family member, right? But more importantly, have a personal, well, maybe not more importantly, but have a personal property memorandum. Inventory those sentimental items, those valuable items, assign them clearly, and don't leave it up to your kids to figure it out because it always leads to disputes. I do this all the time with my clients, and it really makes a difference. So you don't want to leave it up to memory or to greed, right? Well, I've got some others coming up, but I just wanted to take a break, and we're also going to talk about the top 5 worst family offenses at a funeral home. So stick with me. Welcome back to Boomer Time. Nancy Cogar here, and I know you know what I'm talking about when it comes to this episode. Family drama. It's, a constant battle, but what about family drama at the funeral home? I know some of you out there have stories, and you're welcome to share them with me. They might end up on a future podcast, though, but I'll hide the names to protect the innocent. Well, you got to be careful as to who is going to give the eulogy, right? Emotions can run wild. Well, one client's funeral turned into a verbal battle when the estranged brother who had been imbibing grabbed the mic during the eulogy and proceeded to tell everyone how the deceased had never been there for him. Cue the gasps. It was very uncomfortable at the buffet later, believe me. So lesson here is plan who gets to speak at your service and who doesn't get to speak, and make it clear and make it somewhere where it can be found and enforced, right? These are just a few, but there are worse ones. We will talk about those. And as I mentioned before the break, I want to talk about the top 5 worst family offenses at the funeral home. But before I go there, of course I'm a lawyer, so I wanted to look at laws that specifically target bad behavior at funerals. Well, there doesn't appear to be any specific law here in Tennessee as far as behavior at funerals, but there are laws, of course, against public intoxication, right? Disturbing the peace, threatening someone, all kinds of illegal activities, battery, right? All those things would apply. You could be visibly intoxicated at a funeral, and that could lead to an arrest. You could be engaged in disruptive behavior that, is just disturbing the peace. Or, just doing plain old illegal things. Context really matters because these specific laws might be applicable based on the nature of the behavior, right? So an argument could be disturbing the peace. But, common sense prevails here, you would hope. Maintaining order and respect is the most important priority at those funerals. Actions that disrupt the peace or cause a disturbance could lead to legal consequences. Just behave yourself, right? So here are the top 5 worst behaviors at funerals. And it's a quick list of what I consider the most common and cringeworthy bad behavior I've seen. Fighting over the obituary. Why wasn't my name listed? They got my name wrong. I'm not in there at all, right? Ugh. Write your obituary ahead of time, or have the family do it together. Arguing over seating. Yes, this happens at funerals. This one, I wish it wasn't on the list, but taking selfies with the deceased. I just, mm, mm, mm. No explanation needed, right? Okay, bringing up the will at the wake. So they start saying, who's got the house, right? This is not appropriate funeral talk. What about surprise guests that show up? The secret girlfriend? The ex wife? The estranged sibling? It happens. So, how do you avoid the chaos? I wanted to talk a little bit about the part that's really important, how to avoid, rather, becoming one of these stories. You should create a funeral directive. Okay, this is a document that spells out your funeral wishes, the clothes you want to wear, the location, the type of casket you want, open casket, closed, music, pallbearers, all of it. It's legally binding in many states, and it removes the guesswork. This is something I do often with my clients. We set parameters, even down to the little fine details. Maybe even, like I said, write to the obituary yourself. Who knows you better than you, right? Choose a designated decision maker. You would think this one would be obvious, but pick one person and back them up legally. You can name a funeral agent in your will, but I prefer you do it on a separate directive. Okay, so otherwise, family members might have an equal say or might try to have an equal say or a different say, and that is a recipe for chaos. 3, this falls back on what I said about personal property. Write a personal property memorandum. This is a simple add on to your will, all in your handwriting. Write a list of who gets what: jewelry, photos, grandpa's pipe, sentimental items. This prevents squabbles over keepsakes, okay? And don't say, oh, my kids will figure it out, because they're not going to. There's going to be an argument, okay? Or the argument might happen with the stuff that nobody wants. So make a plan for that too. 4, prepay and set aside funds. All right, money is one of the top reasons for drama, right? Prepay your funeral through a reputable funeral home. Or alternatively, set aside funds in a payable on death or life insurance burial policy. There's no scrambling that way. There's no arguing over cost. It's already taken care of. 5, communicate early and often. So I think this is something that your family has to have a meeting about while you're alive. I know these things are hard to talk about, but they're important. Let them know what you have planned and your preferences. Doesn't have to be heavy. Maybe coffee, make it casual, but be clear. Keep the peace during a time when peace should be the overriding emphasis. Well, that's pretty good advice. What do the people behind the scenes have to say about all this? Well, funeral home directors do, try to downplay drama, but they've got some stories in the vault, and I've found a few. So I'm going to share some of those with you right after this. Hey, so what do those funeral home directors have to say about family drama? Like I said, they have some stories in the vault. I found a few. All right, here we go. And I'm not sharing these in any kind of sensical order. 1, believe it or not, a not so deceased husband. This funeral director said they had a reverend talk about the deceased woman finally being with her dearly departed dead husband. Well, He didn't know, but actually the husband was alive and was sitting in the front row at the service. You can't make stuff like this up, folks. Funeral directors on the run. So then in this case, the funeral, they were following the hearse, right? But they found out they were following a hearse from another funeral. They had to go all the way back to the church to have the right procession. That must have been embarrassing. Circle of life. So I've never heard of this, but this makes sense that this would happen. So a woman gave birth and went into labor at a funeral home during a service. Hidden cell phone. There's always something with a cell phone. It just never stops. So this funeral director shared that they dropped their cell phone out of their pocket when they were leaning over the casket, trying to help prep the deceased. I didn't notice it at the time, but then they were on call that night and, they thought they lost their phone. And they went out and bought a new one. Well, the next day before they closed the casket, the funeral director nonchalantly asked or checked under the deceased person's legs, and guess what? There was the cell phone. Can you imagine if they didn't get that phone and it started ringing during the viewing? No. Put up your dukes, right? Fist fights. Thankfully, the law was there at the request of the family. There's an idea. If you've got a really, reckless crew, you probably want to tell the funeral home so they're prepared, but have some security there. Shoo. Maybe a big, strong bouncer, right? Angry walker. Wow. Well, the boss at the funeral home in this instance said they were caught in the crossfire when Grandma threw her walker at another family member. There was a UFC breakout, ultimate fighting. You can just imagine. There was a professional former UFC fighter that passed away. And the funeral director had to break up a fight out in front of the chapel between the fighter's sister and his ex-girlfriend. Boy, that was fun. And there was one here where they were directing a funeral for an elderly man. And believe it or not, his wife died during the service, right in the front row. I could see that happening, actually, because of the stress and the overwhelm. I've seen people pass out, not hydrated enough just from the stress. But can you imagine? Finally, breaking and entering. The craziest thing this funeral director said was when someone tried to break into the funeral home in the middle of the night. They lived in an apartment upstairs. People should be more afraid of the living, they say, than the dead. Why would someone break into a funeral home? What if the mistress shows up at the funeral? Well, what if the funeral home picks up the mistress in the limo instead of the widow? Like I said, you can't make this stuff up. And of course, there have been car crashes leaving, the hearse or the other cars leaving and not leaving because of a car crash. This last one, this sounds like somebody I know, okay? It was a woman, her son passed away, and she wanted to share the eulogy at her own son's funeral or memorial service. So, after first calling him a litany of derogatory names, she then proceeded to call her boyfriend, who was younger than her deceased son, to the front and asked him to play that song. And he played Amazing Grace, and she and the man slow danced in front of her son's casket. Oh, I, like I said, you can't make this stuff up. Well, got some final thoughts coming up. It looks like, grief makes people act out. It's messy, it's raw, sometimes it brings out the worst, but I am telling you, a little planning goes a long way. Okay, so that's the goal here. You need to have your family focus on remembering you, not wrestling, not duking it out, not stealing jewelry, right? At the service. So if you haven't started your estate plan, now's the time. And if you have one and it's old, dust it off, see if it needs to be updated, and add a funeral directive, okay? Your future self and your family is going to thank you. And you can call me to schedule your strategy session if you need help with that. I'll see you next time.